Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitical risk and insurance meet. I'm your host, David Benyon. This is a special episode produced in association with Verisk Maplecroft. The topic is Verisk Maplecroft's new Strikes, Riots and Civil Commotion SRCC model for the United States, the market's first probabilistic SRCC catastrophe model. My two guests are Torbjorn Soltvedt, Associate Director, Global Risk Insight at Verisk Maplecroft, and Sam Haynes, Head of Data Analytics at Verisk Maplecroft. Maplecroft is the global risk unit of insurance, technology and risk services provider Verisk. Strikes, riots and civil commotion events are emerging as the top concern for political violence insurers. Since 2017, SRCC has led to $10 billion of insured losses, compared to $1 billion for terrorism. Social unrest in 2020 in the US topped $3 billion in industry-wide insured losses, and a 1 in 100-year event in Verisk Maplecroft's catalogue would be more than twice as severe. The new SRCC model for the US enables exposure management, cat modelling, and underwriting teams to quantify the potential losses and associated business interruption from SRCC events, to make more informed decisions relating to pricing, capital allocation, risk management, underwriting and mitigation. So this is a topic that's right at the top of the agenda for the insurance industry and the clients it serves. And the new SRCC model is at the very forefront of cat modelling developments amidst a volatile landscape for civil unrest and geopolitical risk. So that's all from me. Enjoy the conversation. Guys, firstly, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Before we get to our main topic for today, I just thought we should touch briefly on the events in the Middle East in recent days, with the US intervention, airstrikes on the Iranian nuclear program, and then this sort of will it or won't it ceasefire situation, and Trump clearly getting very frustrated at the Israelis already. But Tor, you co-wrote a briefing just before this with a colleague of yours saying that a US strike was very likely to happen. So obviously that proved to be. But now that it has happened, and this is a question for both of you, any kind of key conclusions you'd like to draw?
Yeah, I think if you look all the way back over the last year and a half, I think the one thing that really stands out is that we've had some very rapidly changing developments and changing dynamics. So for underwriters, that's obviously been a challenge. It's been a challenge for us as political risk analysts. A lot of essentially new situations and new developments. And if you think about non-state actors like the Houthis launching ballistic missiles at ships, not something we've seen before. Now we've had a direct war between Israel and Iran, another very significant and new development with US strikes directly against Iran's nuclear program. So there's obviously been a lot of concerns around what this means for kind of exposure to infrastructure in the region. We've seen a very clear impact in Israel in terms of energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure being damaged by ballistic missiles, and then running alongside that, we've had this long-running concern that eventually the Gulf states would get dragged in and that there could be damage to infrastructure there as well. Again, another region where underwriters have deployed quite heavily. In terms of what we've seen, the strikes against Qatar, they were pretty limited and limited damage there. Now it seems to be the case that the ceasefire brokered by the US is holding. But as we look ahead, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of where are we with Iran's nuclear program? What is Israel's willingness to strike against Iran in the future? And is it going to be more difficult for the Gulf states to remain that neutral stance that they've managed to do pretty well so far?
I would add on from a sort of protest point of view, looking at this from an SRCC point of view, it's another reason why there may be protests in a range of different countries. You can understand how the people of Iran would be very, firstly, fearful of what's happening to them, but also very frustrated with their regime. We've seen protests in Iran quite recently over the last few years where there have been quite violent protests. Likewise, you could see this feeding protests in Israel and also in the US as well. So it's just these types of events, they all add to the volatile, quite unpredictable conditions that could see people protesting in a range of different countries and then seeing that there may be some escalation from that as well.
Okay, well, we'll get on to actually our main topic for today in a sec, which is, of course, the new SRCC model that Maplecroft has released. But before we get to that, we need to have some introduction. So could you each introduce your respective roles at Maplecroft and how you contribute respectively to the development of the SRCC risk model? Tor, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I've worked in political risk for I think it's about 16 years now. And in terms of my background specifically, it very much started out as a Middle East analyst. That was my main area of focus. It's still a region that I continue to cover in my current role at Maplecroft. But then I also lead our qualitative content, more broadly for the insurance sector. So looking specifically at things like political violence, especially SRCC, which we see very much at the moment as a growing focus for the industry. And in terms of my role specifically, it's more rooted in the qualitative side of our analysis. But it's important to kind of point out that all of the analysis that we provide is very much anchored in our data and in our models that Sam and his analytics team develop and maintain. So what that means in practice, in my work, it really means that I kind of sit down and I work with our teams of regional and country analysts. And then we then provide analysis using our data, combining that with our country expertise for insurance clients. So, that can be things like helping to identify global trends, whether that's SRCC or political violence, helping to flag where there are particular regions or particular countries or cities that we're concerned about. Or it can be, in some cases, the opposite, where we're really kind of helping identify where there might be opportunities to write more risk, whether that's for SRCC or whether that's for land on war or other types of political violence related risks.
Sam?
So I lead the data analytics team here at Maplecroft. So what myself and the team do is we look after all of Maplecroft's data assets. So first and foremost, this is our country risk data. This is essentially a tool to make our clients' lives easier. We measure about 200 different risk issues across political violence, human rights, economic issues, environment, climate change. And the data is essentially used as a way to screen supply chains, investments, operations, and increasingly assist underwriters with underwriting decisions and also help provide that information to manage exposures for a range of different PV risks. So SRCC is a fairly narrow part of what we do, but it's specifically built for insurers. We're looking at the types of civil unrest that lead to insured losses, the drivers of those things, and the sort of the two main tools in the toolkit to sit alongside the qualitative content that Tor and team provide relate to a kind of a global view of SRCC, which is our predictive scores, where we cover every country in the world at a sort of a county level or equivalent in the US. And then the very recently released CAT model, which is just for the US now, but that is something that we would potentially expand to other geographies in the future, primarily major insured markets. But it gives you the types of outputs that you'd be familiar with if you were from a CAT modeling background. So dollar losses, basically, quantifying the loss.
Sorry, Sam, I just wanted to stay with you and just explicitly ask what the SRCC risk model is designed to do.
Yeah, so it is building on the principles of our sister company, Extreme Event Solutions, what they do in terms of NatCat. So it is, rather than giving a best estimate of the next 12 months globally, it is providing a range of plausible scenarios of how SRCC might unfold, in this case, in the United States. The benefit of that is that you can use it via tools such as Touchstone, that is built to go into the Touchstone product that Verisk produces, to provide financial metrics of SRCC losses. So average annual losses for a given set of exposures, what does your losses look like for a 1 in 20, 50, 100 year SRCC event? A catalogue essentially of SRCC events, most of which will be quite small, some of which will be larger, kind of comparable to historical US events like George Floyd 2020 or the LA Riots 92 or some of the 5 other major SRCC events since the end of the Second World War in the US. But it's also to capture those tail events. That's the point of a CAT model. Capture the scenarios that are plausible but just haven't been seen yet. What is a 1 in 100? What is a 1 in 250 year event look like? And how could that potentially unfold in the US in terms of its geographic footprint and its sort of overall intensity as well?
And Tor, from your perspective, who's the model aimed at and how would they use it in their decision making?
Yeah, so in terms of the global SRCC predictive scores, which I work more with, so far the main use case for that has really been in underwriting and in exposure management. And really what the predictive scores do, they help enable people like PV underwriters and exposure analysts and modelers, specialty reinsurers more broadly, to essentially forecast and monitor geospatial SRCC risk. So, from an underwriting point of view, it can help with things like pricing and reviewing premiums. It can help to make sure that written risks adhere to set exposure limits, or it can be used to kind of carve out particular risks. And then from a exposure management point of view, it can be very useful for things like portfolio management, especially when it comes to things like to help determine and set exposure limits, trying to anticipate potential losses, and things like refining probable maximum loss estimates. The central aim is really to kind of provide a more thorough and a more kind of forward-looking base for understanding and managing SRCC risk. We, like everyone else, had obviously seen events like Chile in 2019, the United States in 2020, South Africa in 2021. So the aim of that first kind of model, the SRCC predictive scores, was to come up with something that would help avoid a repeat of those types of losses.
Yeah, so Sam, let's try and get under the hood, so to speak, of the model. We've talked about some of those risk scores. Just talk us through what's under the hood and what are some of the key factors or data points that can drive changes in those SRCC scores.
Absolutely. So we'll start top to bottom. So the engine of the CAT model is essentially the work we did to establish the relationship between predictors of SRCC events and then the severity of those events. So to give you a few examples, there's 12 predictors in the model, things that we've shown that drive future SRCC loss events. Now they fall into a few different groups. So things like protest size is very important. The more people on the street, the more impactful they can be. But size isn't everything when it comes to SRCC. You have some countries with a very rich history of large protests, South Korea, Japan being a couple of good examples, but they sort of never or very rarely escalate into anything particularly violent. So having people on the street is very important. It's also very important to have the types of social grievances that can motivate people to protest quite violently. So some of these will be very intuitive, things like inflation, unemployment, things like the presence of police killings, things like inequality. There's a range of other factors in there as well that are important in sort of driving that grievance to get people to protest in the first place. Another important factor is the type of regime, so the government essentially that runs the country. You see SRCC more in democracies. If you look at kind of presidential democracies, most of the major SRCC events in the last few years have occurred in those types of regions. There's a sort of space to protest. People are allowed to protest. You don't get the sort of the authoritarian oppression you get in, for example, like Kazakhstan in bloody January in 2022, I think it was. Those kind of predictors, that's sort of the engine of this whole thing. We then perturb those predictors. So essentially create scenarios where we kind of dial them up and dial them down. Sort of create a perfect storm for SRCC in one case, and then cases where the factors are not really going to drive much severe SRCC. That essentially creates the catalogue of SRCC intensities for the US. We then want to bring that down geographically. So SRCC occurs in certain kinds of locations, generally high population density, downtown areas, places to loot, places to protest outside of, places that protesters can get to easily, places where they're visible to the media. That's sort of the intensity part, essentially. Then we're bringing in damage curves, looking at things like arson, looting, and the associated BI from those things as well. Then essentially what you have there is the hazard and the engineering part of a CAT model. You then bring in your exposures and the very powerful financial model that we benefit from Verisk to essentially get losses. So in a nutshell, you're going from a country level intensity, dispersing that geographically over a country, applying damage factors to then obtain a loss measures for a certain set of exposures.
So Tor, we've seen high profile civil unrest events, certainly in the US. We saw the BLM protests a few years ago and much more recently in Los Angeles. So yeah, with some useful examples, how does the model help users to understand where you might have similar events likely to occur next? So thinking more predictively and assess how severe those effects might be.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's an exercise that we've tried to do this year. We've looked at potential countries of concern over the next 12 months, and then we've also done the opposite, where we've looked at countries where the risk is going in the right direction, and there might be an opportunity to write more risk. But I think if you look at the kind of global level and you look around the world, it's pretty much only East Asia and Oceania where you don't have at least a few countries on the very highest risk end of the spectrum. So we do see that the data is telling us that it's getting harder to anticipate exactly where high impact events are going to ignite. We do see some kind of regional trends. We see that South America is still very much the highest risk region overall. You could also say the Americas more broadly, if you add in the United States and Mexico as well, both very high risk for SRCC at the moment. And as I said, when you drill down to the country level, that's where you start to see some kind of pretty significant movements in both directions, both positive and negative. So earlier this year in March, we looked at 5 countries that were heading in a more negative direction, but at the same time, these are countries that have avoided large-scale SRCC events in recent years. And I think from that exercise, one country that really stood out as an interesting case is Brazil. And we see that Brazil, over the next 12 months, is ranked as the second highest risk country in the world on our predictive scores at the moment. But we haven't seen any large-scale, damaging civil unrest that have led to significant insured losses in recent years. So that's unusual for a country to be, among the 10 highest risk countries in the world and not to have seen that. And when I speak with our Americas analysts, they are, at the moment, when it comes to Brazil, specifically concerned about crime. We also see that in our data. We see that crime is an increasing driver of SRCC risk on our predictive scores. And one thing that is a particular concern at the moment is that clashes between security forces and criminal gangs are intensifying. So there is a concern that that type of violence could spill over into much wider social unrest. So Brazil is a country we're keeping a close eye on at the moment. And then just to mention briefly the opposite, Chile. A very interesting case for obvious reason. We had the very damaging events back in 2019 with about $3 billion in insured losses. And now we're seeing over the last few years, Chile's performance on our SRCC predictive scores is improving. It's still very high risk, but it's moved from second highest risk in the world to 9th highest risk. So Chile, one where there has obviously been a big effort to address some of the underlying causes of the 2019 riots. So there's been pension reform. Again, like Brazil, crime is another area of concern. When we look at the risk drivers for Chile, crime is the only one that is actually going in the wrong direction. So for the authorities in Chile, crime is something that they need to get more of a grip on if they want to continue that positive trajectory.
To add from the US specific perspective and the LA riots very recently, one of the purposes of the catalogue and the 500,000 events that are in the event years that are in the catalogue is to find similar stochastic events, similar stochastic years, where you can almost perform like a counter narrative or sort of an alternative version of what actually happened and look at what could have happened. So we actually did this for the LA riots very recently. So although they were overwhelmingly peaceful, in fact, LA is a bit of a misnomer because they covered many, many cities in the US. So we can look for events that look like those riots. So we did this recently. So looking at the cities where there were the No King riots, find a similar stochastic event, and you see losses that are very, very large. So high single-digit billions of dollars. That's primarily a function of the fact that the footprint of these riots is very large. So if you take all the cities that had riots or protests rather recently and look for SSEs that have a footprint in those locations, you're dealing with a multi-city major SRCC event. And you can find events in the catalogue that tell you what the losses are. Similarly, if you just focus on LA, so just looking at the downtown parts of LA, look for SSEs in that location. And I think the biggest event in the catalogue has something like $500 million losses for a very concentrated but quite violent, geographically narrow riot. You can also extend this back through time. So you also looked at the LA 92 riots that were quite broad in terms of their footprint. They encompassed quite a large area of LA. $1 billion losses in 92, about $2.2 billion losses in 2024 dollars. And again, look for similar stochastic events there. There's quite a wide range, a few dozen in the catalogue that look like that, but it enables you to perform counterfactuals, understand if something had sparked those protests and perhaps it was confined to LA, what would that have looked like? If there was a spark that then spread like George Floyd did, what would that have looked like? So it's this sort of kind of counterfactual type analysis that is quite useful.
Tor, over to you again. What are some of the broader trends or global developments you're seeing that could shape SRCC risk in the year ahead?
Yeah, we've obviously seen SRCC risk shift massively over the last 10 years at least, and specifically since 2019 with the riots in Chile. Sam talked about this earlier, and we can look back over the last few decades and kind of see how severe civil unrest has been at different times in history. We've obviously had, previous kind of cycles of heightened civil unrest activity around the world. But this kind of clustering of events that we've seen, especially between 2019 and 2023, across those, big events in Chile, the United States, South Africa, and France, $10 billion combined in insured losses, that's pretty much set a new baseline. 5 of those types of events in the space of 5 or 6 years. That's something that we haven't really seen before. So that obviously raises the question of why have we seen this increase in high impact events? There's maybe a temptation to maybe hope that these are just outliers and that will end up reverting to the mean. There's also the question of what has driven this increase in risk. And I think when we look at our own data and we look at the external political and economic environment around the world, there are good reasons to assume that risks are going to remain higher for longer. We've had, for example, a very sustained period of socioeconomic pressure. As Sam said, socioeconomic indicators are an important part of the SRCC predictive scores. You can even go as far back as the 2008 financial crisis and stagnating wage growth in a lot of countries since then. Then more recently, very high impact events like COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then also when you look at potential amplifiers, something like social media. And when we think about social media and the potential for social media to take local events and turn them into either nationwide events or even international events, the potential for that is probably greater than it ever has been.
You saw that in the Arab Spring more than a decade ago. It was so easy for local populations to see what was going on in the next city or even the next country in the region. We certainly saw it in, I think, sort of the colour revolutions that took place, and definitely Chile.
You can look at it, a few very recent examples as well. So you had the riots in Northern Ireland very recently, Ireland last year, and the UK, all related to essentially misinformation tied to the perpetrators of crimes and their background, and that igniting protests against those communities that they appear to come from. So there's that aspect as well, where it kind of fans the flames, with the actual information underlying it isn't necessarily even true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen that with all the big events. I think South Africa was a particularly interesting case where, there was an element of misinformation being spread on social media, and that very much contributing to, the severity of that particular event. With France, again, the US in 2020, the potential for local events to spread very quickly across a country is something that is a relatively new development in terms of how quickly information and potentially misinformation or disinformation can spread. So one of the areas where things are kind of changing very, very rapidly, there's obviously concerns now about, artificial intelligence being used to spread misinformation and disinformation. Not something that we've seen very kind of clear cases of yet, but clearly something that is going to be a concern over the coming years.
There's a lot of interest in SRCC, certainly within, I think, Lloyd's market recently, coming up with scenario analysis for potential future events. And Sam, you already mentioned counterfactual scenarios. So could you share an example of how clients might use those features within the model to plan for and to mitigate future losses?
So looking at counterfactuals is definitely a useful approach. My understanding is that's what happens a lot in the NatCat space. So what if Hurricane Sandy happened again on the east coast of the US? What would my losses look like today, given my exposures and how those have changed over time? So definitely a kind of if this, then what type analysis, which makes a lot of sense. I would say that the benefit of having a CAT model is that probabilistic approach, it takes out that human choice, I suppose, of deciding what the event might be and then what the implications are. Instead, it kind of factors in the whole range of plausible events. So you can say things like, on average, my loss would be X, or the losses from a 1 in 20 year event would be Y. Counterfactuals are useful, but I think there's probably a tendency to look at the more extreme cases. And there actually aren't that many major SRCC loss events in history. And there are probably a fairly large number of those lower level events that people don't necessarily know about, don't necessarily make the news headlines, but do result in some kind of insured loss. And there's about 1 or 2 SRCC events in the US per year. They're quite small, mostly speaking. They're not 2020 or 92, but they do occur. So it's being able to assess the hazard of SRCC in totality rather than kind of picking scenarios, although that is a useful thing to do as well.
A question for both of you to round off then. So what would you say is the most valuable takeaway for insurers or brokers looking to strengthen their political violence underwriting in today's risk environment?
We obviously live in pretty volatile times at the moment, and I think it's fair to say that it's getting more difficult to try to figure out where the next big SRCC event or where the next big conflict is going to break out. Last year, we obviously saw that New Caledonia was something that caught everyone off guard. So I think there is very much a need to consider and look at new solutions and approaches. That's obviously something that we very much want to play a part in collaboration with others. I think the more perspectives, the more experiences from different functions and industries that we can bring together, the better. And then also, I think to end on a slightly more positive note, we've talked a lot about risks around the world, but I think we can now see that at least the last sort of mega event, the last $3 billion event, that's now almost 4 years behind us. And when we look at our data, we don't see any kind of signs of SRCC risk getting significantly worse over the last 3 or 4 years. So we have to be careful to kind of not kind of paint this narrative that it's getting too risky to underwrite SRCC risk around the world. There's obviously a lot of opportunities, and this is something that can be managed. And coming back to what Sam was saying earlier in terms of sparks, I think trying to identify specific sparks for whether wars or civil unrest is something that is extremely difficult, almost impossible. I think back to when I lived in Cairo. This was just a few years before the outbreak of the Arab Spring. And, to me at that time, there wasn't anything clearly indicating that something on that scale was about to happen. But being able to understand what the kind of underlying risk of civil unrest is in a given location over the next 12 months is something that can help manage these sort of risks in a better way. And that's what we're hoping to do.
I think we potentially are at a moment in time where SRCC is becoming a cause of material insured losses. These weren't really conversations that were happening before Chile. And now there's lots of conversations, there's tools in the market. We're doing things like this podcast, talking about SRCC. So it's obviously a thing in people's minds. And with 5 major SRCC events in the last 6 or so years, I do wonder if we're at a similar point as we were in the 90s, where cat modeling was becoming a necessary feature of natural hazards. We had Hurricane Andrew. The impact of that was significant in terms of the impact on the sector. So are we at a moment now where this hazard of SRCC needs to be taken more seriously, and the type of tools that are deployed to assess it and measure it start to match those that are used for nat cat modeling? It's sort of difficult to tell. As Tor says, you don't want to kind of over-egg this hazard, but people have seen major losses in the last few years.
Political violence as a standalone line of insurance business has grown and continues to add new capacity going into it. And that's, as you say, obviously we're talking on this podcast, and were it not for that interest and growth in that line of business, we might not be. And of course, if it's there, if you've got underwriters who've got twice the capacity to write this year than they had last year, all the more important then that they have sophisticated data analytics and modeling to give them a bit more confidence when they're selecting and pricing those risks.
There's also an equivalence of losses between some nat cat events and SRCC events in the last few years. If you look at the floods in France and Belgium, similar losses, I believe, to the French fires in 2023. So essentially, if you're using tools such as cat models to assess nat cat events, you should also really be using those same types of tools to assess SRCC PV events, because the impacts are potentially the same in terms of insured losses. Okay.
Well, thank you both for joining me today. It's been a fun conversation. I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Tor. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Verisk Maplecroft. I hope you found the conversation insightful on what's clearly a big topic for the insurance industry, particularly for political violence underwriters and the risk landscape facing their insureds. The new SRCC model is a good example of breaking new ground in the risk modelling space, improving the quality of risk intelligence and predictive analytics that are available to underwriters. I've been your host, David Bennion, and I'd like to thank my two wonderful guests, Torbjorn Soltvedt and Sam Haynes, both of Verisk Maplecroft. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.